What's going on, everyone? Welcome back. Patrick here. Moving on to the next question. So a company this year pays dividends of $11,200 and has a retention ratio of 65%. It also had beginning equity of $150,000 and a debt to equity ratio of 1/3. What will the new debt to equity ratio be if the company grows at, number one, its internal growth rate, and then number two, its sustainable growth rate? So starting with number one, the internal growth rate. What is the internal growth rate? What is the formula? Well, it's basically the return on assets times the retention ratio, or 1 minus the payout ratio. So we need to find this rate to see what the company is going to grow at. And then once we have that final information, the ending balance sheet, we can get that debt to equity ratio on the ending balance sheet. So for the return on assets, what we're going to need is the net income and then the beginning assets. So we need to get that information with what we're given here. So notice we're told the amount of dividends that are being paid and the retention ratio. And notice with that information, we can actually find out what the net income is going to be. That's what we need over here. So from net income, we know that there are dividends that are paid. And then there's an amount that's retained within the company. And so notice we're given the amount of dividends, $11,200. And we're given the retention ratio of 65%. And with those two pieces of information right there, that's enough to find what the net income is going to be. Because if the retention ratio is 65%, what's the payout ratio? Well, the payout ratio is just 100% minus that, which is 35%. Remember, both of these have to equal, when you add them up, 100% of the net income. So if this is 65%, it implies that this has to be 35%. And if we know 35% of the net income is the amount of dividends that are paid, and that's $11,200, we could solve for net income, right? The dividends, if we make this an equation, is equal to the net income times the payout ratio. Well, the dividends is $11,200. The net income is what we're solving for, and then the payout ratio is 35% or 0.35. This always has to be a decimal right there. And so we could divide both sides by 0.35 to solve for that x. And so the net income would be $32,000. Net income is $32,000. Right? So we can get that with that information that we were given. We first have to find the payout ratio from the retention ratio, then take the dividends divided by the payout ratio to get the net income. Then if we want the amount retained, which we're actually going to need in the question, so 65% of 32,000, 0.65 times 32,000 gives us 20,800. Another way you could have actually got this value is subtracting these two, right? 32,000 net income, 11,200 of that is paid out, which means that minus that, 20,800 of it is retained within the company, right? So just from that first sentence there, we can get a lot of information. Now, what else? What other information are we given? Notice we're given the beginning equity amount and the debt to equity ratio of 1/3. So we can find out from that information the entire balance sheet at the beginning of the year, which is going to be useful in this question. So splitting these up, we got assets, we got debt, and then we have equity. So we're told that the beginning equity is $150,000. That's this amount. over here. But what we need for the internal growth rate is the beginning assets. And we're given the debt to equity ratio of 1/3. So debt over equity equals 1/3. Notice that we could solve for the debt over here because we're given the equity of 150,000. And then once we have the debt, we can easily solve for the assets by adding that right side of the balance sheet up. So cross multiplying here, we'd have 3x equals 150,000. Divide both sides by 3, we would get 50,000. So this here, the debt would be 50,000. Adding those up, we get 200,000. And remember, this is the beginning balance sheet, the balance sheet at the beginning of the year. Right? So we use the debt to equity ratio to find the debt, added them up to get the assets of 200,000. And now, let's sort of split these up. We have enough information to plug in here. So the retention ratio is 0.65, or the payout ratio is 35%. 1 minus that is 0.65, but we weren't given that. We were given the retention ratio, so we could directly plug it in here. Net income over beginning assets, the net income is 32,000. We solve for that. The beginning assets, 200,000. And so multiplying all of this, we would end up with 0.104 or 10.4%. Sorry, that's not a dollar amount, that's a percentage. So that is the internal growth rate. So now that we have the internal growth rate, what we can do, we can use that information to find the balance sheet at the end of the year. And then from the balance sheet at the end of the year, we can find that new debt to equity ratio. So if a company is growing at a certain rate, that means its assets are growing at that rate. So we'll have assets, we'll have debt, we'll have equity. So to grow the assets, we got the beginning assets, 200,000, and then we would multiply that by 1 plus the growth rate, the internal growth rate of 10.4%, but we would plug in the decimal over here. So that would be 0.104, like that. And when you do that calculation, you'd end up with $220,800. So that's what these assets are going to be over here. Now, to find this right side of the balance sheet, there's actually 2 ways to go about it. So the first way is we could find what this equity amount is, because remember, the change in equity is going to be either from new equity being issued, which is not happening in this question, or from retained earnings. And we know what the retained earnings are, or the addition to the retained earnings. It's $2,800. So the new equity amount is going to be 150 plus 2,800, which would give us 170,800. Right? And the difference between these is going to be the debt, which is going to be 50,000, and that makes sense. Why does it make sense? Because notice the debt isn't changing, because when the company, if you remember from the lecture videos, when we went over the internal growth rate, it means that the company cannot take additional financing externally. And you can't produce debt internally, quote unquote, right? You'd always have to go issue debt externally. So the only growth that can happen is internally, and that comes from the retained earnings. And so adding the beginning equity and the addition to retained earnings, we get the ending equity, and then the difference between this is 50,000, which makes sense. The debt should be staying the same. And so that's actually the second way that you could have got this right side of the balance sheet, is you could have just put the debt of $50,000 here. And you wouldn't even have to find out this equity using the beginning equity and the addition to retained earnings, right? Because the debt has to stay constant, can't take on external financing. If you're growing at the internal growth rate, at the sustainable growth rate you can, but at the internal growth rate, any growth has to be internally produced, which means that the debt has to stay constant. So we could just put 50,000 here, subtract these, and you would get that same amount of 170,800, right? So this 170,800, it checks out in multiple checkpoints, whether we get the debt first and then subtract these to get that equity, or if we find equity the manual way of taking the beginning equity and adding that addition to retained earnings, right? Both ways that equity is 170,800. And so now we have the entire balance sheet at the end. What's the question asking? What's the new debt to equity ratio? Well, it would be the 50,000 over the equity amount of $170,800. And when you do that calculation, you'd end up with 0.29274. Right? If we don't round it to, or if we round it to 5 decimal places, a lot of times you'll just see an answers to 2 decimal places, 0.29. You could also maybe take this and try to simplify it as a fraction. And I actually recommend that you get comfortable doing that because you never know. This could be a multiple choice question, and then the debt to equity ratio can be given as a fraction. So notice we could divide both this and this by 100. And then from here, we can divide both by 2. So we'd have 250. Over here, we'd have 854. Divided by 2 again, we'd have 125 over 427. And then 125 over 427, can't divide it by 5. Yeah, I think this here is the simplified fraction for that. So just be careful. This could be a multiple choice question, as I mentioned, and then the answer could be given like that potentially. But usually it would be in decimals like that. So those are the different answers for part A if the company grows at the internal growth rate. What about if it grows at its sustainable growth rate? Now, are we going to have to go through this whole process again, grow these assets at the sustainable growth rate, et cetera, et cetera? Well, no, we're not, because sustainable growth rate, what does that mean? Debt to equity ratio is constant. The debt to equity ratio is staying constant, and notice that we're given the debt to equity ratio of 1/3. So that's the answer to number 2. It's not a trick question or anything. We're already given the debt to equity ratio. So the new debt to equity ratio, if it grows at its sustainable growth rate, because that ratio has to stay constant, it's still going to be 1/3. Now, if you wanted to go through the whole process, we've done that in previous videos of finding the sustainable growth rate using the net income and then that beginning equity times the retention ratio, grow the assets by that amount, and then the equity would actually still be the same. It would be this, and then you could find the difference between those to get that debt, and then you'll find that that debt over equity would be 1/3. That ratio would stay constant. So you can go through that if you want for some extra practice. Just make sure that that ending balance sheet is coinciding with that 1/3 debt to equity ratio. So you could do that for extra practice. But yeah, the quick way, number 2, because it's growing at a sustainable growth rate, debt to equity ratio staying constant. We're given the debt to equity ratio at the beginning of the year. It's going to be the same at the end of the year.